Well, Ms. Anne-Marie Lawlor, the prosecuting barrister, was first to her feet to give her closing speech yesterday morning, and she told the jury that what she was about to say to them over the next hour or so was not to be considered evidence. It was simply her take on the evidence that has been called over the past few weeks, which they are free to accept or reject. And she said the fundamental question for them to consider is who killed Ashling Murphy. And she said that she believed it was Jozef Puska, and she ran through her reasoning as to why she felt that was the case. To start with, she said they had a confession from him. He confessed that he killed Ashling Murphy. This was at St James's Hospital in Dublin, just 2 days after he's alleged to have murdered Miss Murphy along the banks of the Grand Canal in Tullamore. When he gave evidence last week, Mr. Puska said that he had no memory of that he had had surgery the night before, that he was on painkillers, and that he didn't remember that conversation. And in relation to that, Ms. Lawlor said, or she described his lack of memory as extraordinary, because they called a medical expert who gave evidence earlier in the trial and who found that the medication he was given, the painkiller oxycodone, had nothing to do with his state of mind at the time that he spoke with Gardaí, had nothing to do with what he said to the detectives. She described his confession in the hospital as unprompted, spontaneous, clear, detailed and unequivocal and unimpeded by medication that he was given or any other factor at St James's Hospital. And she also questioned the reliability of the expert called on behalf of the defence, especially in light of the fact that he based his report on the wrong dosage of oxy, and that was something that he accepted when he was cross-examined by Ms. Lawlor. In relation to the defence's concern that Mr. Puska hadn't been assessed as to his fitness to be interviewed before he spoke with Gardaí in the hospital, Ms. Lawlor said that he wasn't being interviewed when he made that admission. She said that a search warrant was being executed at the hospital that was being explained to him, that Mr. Puska, with the assistance of an interpreter who was on loudspeaker, had made inquiries about the investigation and about the search warrant that was being executed, and that he then asked the interpreter to translate his confession word for word, and he said, "I did it, I murdered, I am the murderer." She said there wasn't any interview. She accused Mr. Puska of being a liar. She said that he lied on multiple occasions, but in her view, when it came to the confession, she said that he wasn't lying that evening. She said that he was there in the ditch along the canal with Ms. Murphy by his own acknowledgement, albeit he said in his evidence that he was trying to help her after she was stabbed by a man who had also attacked him with a knife. She said that if you stab somebody 11 times, the probable consequence is that that person is going to be killed or seriously injured. So she said manslaughter isn't in this case.
And the jury also heard that Ashling Murphy was her own investigator because of the DNA that she got under her fingernails.
Yeah, and Ms. Lawlor did speak about that at length, and the defence barrister Michael Bowman also touched on it in his closing speech. But in relation to what Ms. Lawlor said to the jurors, she reminded them of the pathology evidence, the post-mortem evidence. We heard from a Dr. Sally Ann Collis, the pathologist who carried out the post-mortem, who said that she found what may have been defensive wounds on Ashling Murphy's fingers. And Ms. Lawlor, in relation to those wounds, again, in her opinion, said that she got those wounds as she was trying to save herself, and while she was trying to fight off her attacker, she said that she also scratched him, and that when Gardaí put that to Mr. Puska following his arrest, she described his response as extraordinary. A garbled response about gloves was how Ms. Lawlor put it. She described Ashling, as you say, as an investigator in her own murder, and that the evidence in relation to the identity of her killer was found under her fingernails. And in her view, and again, this wasn't evidence, this is simply her opinion on the evidence, she said that Ashling's attempt to fight her attacker off was the only way that DNA could have got under her fingernails. The defence then, when he was dealing with the issue of that DNA that was found under Ashling's fingernails, he just asked the jury to approach it with great care, and he asked them not to arrive at the same leap of faith, was how he put it, that the prosecution had arrived to in relation to how the DNA got there. Ms. Lawlor also spoke about the evidence of Jenna Stack, a prosecution witness who gave evidence earlier in the trial of going out for a run herself that afternoon with her friend when she came across a man whom the prosecution claimed was Jozef Puska attacking a woman whom the prosecution believed was Ashling Murphy in a hedgerow along the canal. Now, Jenna Stack accepts that she made a mistake the following day when she was asked to take part in an ID parade and she picked out the wrong man. based on the description that she gave of the person that she saw attacking that woman in the ditch. But Ms. Lawlor said that just because she made a mistake, she said people can make mistakes about, facial recognition all the time. And she said that just because she made a mistake, that doesn't mean they should bin all of her evidence. She said that she saw a man holding Ashling down that day, and she was of the belief, the prosecution that is, that was Jozef Puska. She described it as really important evidence. She accused Mr. Puska of pivoting between lying and not remembering things, said that he doesn't remember what he told his family in the aftermath, meetings with the Gardaí in the hospital, a conversation with a friend whom he'd called over to that evening and who dropped him home to Mucklagh at his request, and the confessions. And when it came to his lack of memory in relation to all of those things, she told the jurors that they must ask themselves why it is that he can't remember those things. She also said that his actions after the incident were indicative of his guilt. She accused him of hiding from Gardaí in a ditch for a number of hours. She accused him of fleeing to Dublin afterwards, of shaving to change his appearance, and of stabbing himself to support what she described as his cock and bull story that he too had been attacked along the canal before his attacker had turned his attention to Ashling Murphy. And she said all of the evidence, in her opinion, points to Mr. Puska being guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, and she said she hoped the jury would come to the same conclusion.
And what did we hear from the defence in their closing speech?
Well, Michael Bowman began by speaking about the tragic circumstances of the case. He said that was undoubtedly the case, and he spoke about how difficult it must have been for Ashling's family to have sat through the past few weeks of evidence, and he described them doing so with great dignity. And he went on then to tell the jurors that when it came to the evidence and their work, when it comes to their deliberations, he said they are not allowed to speculate about what may have happened that day. He questioned the prosecution's contention that Mr. Puska was following women around that afternoon. He asked where the evidence was in relation to that. The jurors have seen CCTV footage, and they heard from two female witnesses whom the prosecution say Mr. Puska was following that afternoon. A woman called Beata Borowska said that she was unaware of Mr. Puska's presence, just as Mr. Puska says he was unaware of hers, according to Michael Bowman. And in relation to the other woman's evidence, a woman called Anne-Marie Kelly, whom the prosecution described as a compelling witness, Jozef Puska accepted that he looked at her that day, but he insisted that he wasn't staring at her, as she claimed. She had told the jury that he was staring at her in what she felt was an intimidating way. And Mr. Bowman told the jury in relation to that even if they were satisfied that Mr. Puska was following girls around Tullamore that day, that doesn't mean that he had a predatory, murderous intent. He questioned the reliability of timings extracted from Ashling's Fitbit device. He said there remains a number of unanswered questions in relation to that, so he asked him to be careful with that particular piece of evidence. In relation to the lies that he told the jurors that they must deal with them very carefully, because people, he said, lie for lots of reasons, and that doesn't mean necessarily that they're guilty of anything. He also raised concerns about the failure to have Mr. Puska assessed by his doctor before he was interviewed by Gardaí in hospital. He said that was something that happened at Tullamore Garda Station as soon as he arrived there for questioning after his arrest, but it didn't happen in the hospital while he was still recovering from surgery and on pain medication. And in relation to the confession, he didn't suggest that those words were not said by his client, but he told the jury they'd have to determine whether they can be relied on in the absence of an assessment of his capacity to be interviewed. He told the jurors then to conclude that if they weren't sure about his guilt, or if they think that he probably did it, then that wasn't enough. They must acquit if that's the case. This case must be proven by the prosecution beyond a reasonable doubt. And Mr. Bowman finished his closing speech by inviting them to engage with the evidence in a cold, analytical, critical way, to stress test all of the evidence. And he said that if they did that, he suggested that they'd find they cannot return a guilty verdict.
And we're going to hear from Mr. Justice Tony Hunt today. He's going to continue his charge to the jury this morning.
That's right. He began his charge when the closing speeches finished up yesterday afternoon, and his function, I suppose, at this point is twofold. He must direct the jury on matters of law. He explained his function to the jury yesterday. He deals with all the legal matters. The jurors deal with matters of fact. So they are the judges of the evidence, essentially. And he told them they'd have to be bound by it and any inferences arising from that evidence. And again, to echo what Mr. Bowman had said earlier, he told them that they mustn't speculate. That's simply making things up. There's no room for guesswork either. And he said that if something is of no significance, it doesn't matter, they can move on. Whatever weight they attach to pieces of evidence is entirely up up to them. He spoke about some of the legal fundamentals in this case and any other criminal case, the presumption of innocence. Mr. Puska has obviously pleaded not guilty to this charge, so he is entitled to that presumption of innocence until and unless a point where a jury decides otherwise. The burden of proof, as is the case with any criminal trial, rests with the prosecution. It's not up to Mr. Puska or his defence team to disprove the case being put forward by the presumption or to prove their innocence. And then he spoke about the standard of proof, that very high standard of beyond a reasonable doubt. So he went through all of those various legal principles yesterday. He'll continue doing that this morning. And then the second function at this point for Mr. Justice Tony Hunt is to sum up the evidence for the jurors. So that's likely to take a bit of time this morning. But you would expect if the jury isn't sent out this side of lunch that they'll certainly be sent out to begin their deliberations sometime this afternoon.